I'd like to thank you all for joining me for making sense of the election process, rule of law, and norms. The purpose of this conversation among our panel of faculty experts is to talk about the parts of the legal process that are implicated by this election. And as we think about the election, we at Georgetown are fortunate to have the insights of faculty who are deeply engaged in these issues. And I'm eager to hear their reactions and analysis to the current state of the election and their answer to questions that you submitted in advance of this session. And this will be the first of a number of opportunities we'll have to discuss and to process the election. So I'd like to thank everybody for submitting the insightful questions which help shape today's conversation. And please continue to ask your questions by typing them into the Q&A function on Zoom. So let me begin by introducing our expert faculty panel. Professor Randy Barnett, the Patrick Hotung Professor of Constitutional Law and Director of the Georgetown Law Center for the Constitution. Dean Rosa Brooks, Associate Dean for Centers and Institutes and the Scott Ginsberg Professor of Law and Policy. Aderson Francois, the Agnes Williams Research Professor and Director for the Institute for Public Representation of the Civil Rights Law Clinic. And Professor Victoria Nourse, the Ralph Whitworth Professor of Law. So welcome and thank you very much for joining me in this conversation. So what I'd like to do is just begin on kind of where we are right now in terms of the electoral outcome. So I'm going to start with Dean Brooks and then open it up for comments for the panelists. So Dean Brooks, a few minutes, could you summarize the election results and what we can expect over the next few days?
Bill, that's not fair to ask the hard question. The truth is we don't know quite where we are. I'm sure that many of the people in our audience were, like all of us, up very, very late, either drinking too much coffee or drinking something else, trying to figure out what was going on. We obviously do not have a conclusive result yet. What we have is a small number of swing states in which we don't yet have definitive results. Those include Michigan, Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada, New Mexico. No, I'm sorry, not New Mexico. North Carolina, I believe, still uncalled, and I may be missing one. Others feel free to jump in. It is looking from the projections thus far as though Vice President Biden, the Democratic candidate, is likely to ultimately win all of the mail-in ballots has been counted, and that's the cause of the delay. And actually, to take a step back, we had massive voter turnout this election. We've had a higher voter turnout in terms of percentages in this election than in any election in the last 120 years. The last election that got this level of voter turnout was between McKinley and Williams Jennings Bryan in 1900. So we had record turnout from voters all over the country of every state, every race, every age, every sex, every ideology, et cetera. And because of the pandemic, obviously, we had an unprecedentedly high number of mail-in ballots pretty much across the board. States get to set their own rules on when and how they count those mail-in ballots. And in some states, such as in Florida, they start counting those ballots as soon as they receive them. In other states, such as Pennsylvania, they don't start counting those ballots until election day. So if you have a large number to go through, your election workers, it's going to take them some time. I won't say we know because we know nothing, but what it is looking like so far based on the sort of overtime mail-in ballots counted thus far, it looks as though the Associated Press and Fox have called Arizona for Vice President Joe Biden, although none of the other networks have yet made the same call as far as I know. Wisconsin has gone to Biden. Pretty much all of the networks have called that. It looks likely, but not certain, that by perhaps even the end of this webinar or the end of the evening today, at least, that we will have results in Michigan coming in for sure, I think, maybe, nobody really knows. Georgia also maybe. Pennsylvania results are not expected until probably sometime next week. We also, of course, at the moment, it looks like, and I'm not good at math. That's why I became a law professor. So I'm not even going to try to tell you, how you get to 270, et cetera, et cetera. I'm hoping my colleagues can do that for me. But it is looking at this point as though the most likely outcome is that as the additional mail-in ballots get counted, they're going to put Joe Biden over the edge of 270 to win the Electoral College. Obviously, the Trump campaign is not taking that lying down. We saw in the wee hours of the night, we saw President Trump tweeting away, asserting that there was massive voter fraud without any evidence for that, asserting that the election was being stolen. He was rebuked by that, interestingly, by quite a number of senior GOP elected officials, including people like former Senator Rick Santorum and Chris Christie, former governor of New Jersey, even Mitch McConnell saying, hey, we don't say stuff like that. We let the votes be counted. So right now we're really in a waiting game. Obviously, Trump's tweets notwithstanding, there are, and my colleagues can talk more about this, there is litigation that is being filed in a number of states relating to the counting of those mail-in ballots and recount requests in some areas. So it is not likely, and it's probably really important to remind everybody that the media does not decide who the next president is. The media makes projections, but we have a much more complex process, which we can talk about if people are interested. We don't get an ultimate decision on that until January in a joint session of Congress, which I believe is on January 6th. So at this point, we are dealing in projections. Things are looking good for Biden, but the GOP has certainly not given up, and we do not have anything final yet. Although we may have a more solid projection by the end of the day today.
Okay, so that's good. I think that that sets the stage very well. I think the next two things I want to talk about are actually the congressional elections and the results there, and then also what litigation might follow. But is there anything that anybody wants to add on kind of the state of play right now before we go to those specific topics? Okay. So let's go to the congressional. So obviously as Rosa's presentation showed, our focus primarily has been on the presidential elections, but I'd like to start by now talking about the congressional elections. So I'm going to go Professor Vic Nourse, and then I'd like your thoughts, Professor Randy Barnett. How are the House and Senate races shaping up? And how does that affect kind of what's going to happen in terms of policy in the years ahead? Professor Nourse?
Thank you for having me. And I'll just follow up by saying we only know what we know, as Dean Brooks noted earlier. So there are many House and Senate races that remain undecided. I think there are a couple of things we can confidently say. One is it looks like that the Democrats will remain in charge of the House. It also looks increasingly clear that the Republicans will remain in charge of the Senate, perhaps by less, but that Mitch McConnell will remain majority leader. And it's complicated as to how all of these races will work out, but this is very much contrary to what the polls had indicated. There were a number of projections saying that the Democrats could in fact take over maybe 5, 6, 7 seats. 538 made some pretty aggressive projections. And the results are really quite contrary, which suggests that there's been something wrong that's deeper in the polling than we have seen before. But what does that mean for how we govern? Well, let's just assume that Biden were to win the presidency. If Trump were to re-win the president, well, let's start with Trump. If he wins the presidency, the same thing we've seen over the last 4 years. It's the same Senate, roughly. There's some new characters, but same. And a House that will be in opposition. The real more complicated part for viewers is if Biden wins, because the Senate is really the key. I mean, one of the things I watch closely is the Senate, and why? Because the least known but most important rule in democracy is something about the Senate. I once went to Harvard and I had the gall about 10 years ago to say, what's the most important rule in democracy? And I asked a whole bunch of fancy people this. And no one said anything. And then I said, well, it's Rule 22. I'll give you the number. And no one said anything. And then someone in the back said, they raised their hand. They said, Rule 23 and interpleader. And I said, that's a judicial rule involving pleading. I said, no, that's not the most important rule. I was talking about the rule in the Senate. Yes, they do have rules, and those rules are protected by the Constitution under Article 1, Section 5. And Rule 22 is the cloture rule. Rule 22 means, in effect, that you need 60 votes in the Senate, not 51, 60 votes to pass any piece of legislation. That means if the parties are roughly divided as they are now, you're going to get less legislation, right? So if Biden has an aggressive legislative set of proposals, he's going to have to get 60 votes, right? So that meant that unless the Senate had changed wildly in the Democratic column, that he would have an uphill battle to try to get those. On the other hand, Joe Biden is an old Senate hand. He calls himself a Senate man. So if there's anyone who can figure out how to get to 60, he knows how to do it. It is a stabilizing feature of our democracy, and I think both Professor Barnett and I would agree on that. Most people should not be confused, however, about it. It doesn't mean that all legislation stops. It just means you have to reach agreement, one, and two, on matters involving the budget, matters involving money. There is a 51 vote threshold. There's an exception to this rule called the reconciliation process. If not, our government would have been shut down a long time ago. So what will happen is on things like the budget, the COVID, the infrastructure, these aren't text as in legal text, they're numbers. And those bills can be passed by 51 votes. So it's not as if there's a 60 vote threshold for everything, but for some things, and that will have a significant effect, I think, if Biden's lead remains and he becomes the next president of the United States.
Okay. Professor Barnett?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Thanks for inviting me to participate with my colleagues. I agree with everything that Vic just said. The filibuster rule was, I believe, going to come under challenge, as it has in the past. That is, the filibuster rule was abolished by the Democrats with a simple majority vote for lower court judicial nominees, and then it was abolished for the Supreme Court by a simple majority vote. The simple majority vote way of abolishing it is called the nuclear option. It was abolished for the Supreme Court justices by Republicans. What's left is the legislative filibuster. And I agree with Vic that this is extremely important to ensure bipartisanship in the Senate, which can then check a monoparty or a one-party dominated House. And that looks like it's not going to change. Had that changed, we would be having a completely different discussion starting tomorrow or maybe next week than we are going to have. The next 2 years is going to look very different given this outcome than it would have looked with a Biden victory, assuming there was a Biden victory. What would be the difference? Well, here's some of the things we're not going to be talking about. In addition to not talking about ending the legislative filibuster, because that's not going to be ended, because of that, we're not going to be talking about expanding the number of Supreme Court justices, something that we were talking a lot about in the last few weeks. We're not going to be talking about term limits for justices, something we're talking a lot about. We're not going to be talking about ending the Electoral College by means of the popular vote interstate compact, which requires congressional consent. It's working its way through the states, but it's not effective without congressional consent. We're not going to be talking about that. We're not going to be talking about some of the more radical proposals that Democrats have been favoring that Joe Biden has not been favoring, but which presumably he would come under some pressure from his party to favor. Those we're also not going to be talking about. So there's an awful lot of things. Oh, we're not going to be talking about statehood for District of Columbia, and we're not going to be debating statehood for Puerto Rico. So there's an awful lot, but here's the point. We would have been debating all of those things. They may not have gotten passed, but we would be preoccupied with debates over all of those things. And if you add all of those things together, it would have worked a fundamental change in our structure of government. The Senate would have changed. The Supreme Court would have changed. Lots of things would have changed. That's what's not going to happen if the current trend of voting holds up. That means we're going to be talking about what we might call ordinary politics, ordinary policy. An election of a Biden administration is going to reflect a change in policy in many, many ways. And we're going to see a revival of executive orders as being a good thing. The last 4 years, executive orders were not such a good thing. For 8 years before that, they were a good thing. They're going to go back to being a good thing again. And then we'll see if the Supreme Court has an opinion on the use of executive orders and other uses of the administrative state to advance policy in the absence of congressional agreement, which is something that has dominated every administration over the last, I don't know, 10 or 15 years. So this has been true of the Obama administration, the Trump administration, the Bush administration. There's been an awful lot of lawmaking by the administrative branch, the executive branch, because Congress has not been able to pass laws. So we're going to see a lot more executive branch action, and then we'll see if the Supreme Court has an opinion on the whether that's all within the scope of executive authority. Anyway, I think we're going into a period of more normal politics as a result of this, if these results hold up. And I think that's going to be a significant change than what we would have seen if that result, which had been projected by polls, had come true. And I totally agree with Vic about the failure of the polls. I don't know that it's constitutional, but I think a bill that would abolish polls or abolish polling would greatly, I think we can prohibit anything, right? We can't mandate stuff.
Well, there must be liberty to conduct a poll.
I don't know. I don't think there's an express prohibition. And I believe the necessary and proper clause has been interpreted broadly enough. I believe the necessary and proper clause has been interpreted broadly enough to include a prohibition on all political polling as a means of ensuring the integrity of the electoral process and eliminating election interference. And after that, we can just vote on stuff, which would be a refreshing change of pace.
Yeah, and I think I think both of those are really very important as we're looking at kind of the consequences of the election, because the fact that the Senate seems to be that it will be a Republican Senate, means that even if we have a President Biden, there's a real limit on the kind of legislation that we'll see, and that a lot of the things that 3 days ago were being talked about, and in law schools, expanding the Supreme Court, term limits for justices were two issues that were very much on everybody's mind. That they're, for the next 2 years at least, not going to happen, regardless of what the presidency is. Actually, let me just, on the polls, Professor Dean Brooks, do you have any views on what we can learn for, these are two presidential elections in a row in which the polls have been misleading?
I don't know, Bill, but I'm sort of with Randy. I think we could probably get bipartisan agreement on a constitutional amendment, at least to eliminate that New York Times needle, profoundly hurtful and traumatizing to so many Americans. But and think of all the hours we would all have collectively saved, which we could have dedicated to scholarship, et cetera, if we had not been obsessively refreshing 538. For the last 6 months. I don't know. I'm not an expert on this. I think, my understanding is that theories for how do you get it so wrong? One of them has to do with the fact that the rapid transformation in communication technologies that Americans use, that the old model is, 20 years ago, everybody had landlines and you actually answered your phone when it rang because it was probably somebody you wanted to talk to. And now many Americans don't have landlines, they have cell phones. There's so much cell phone spam that most of us ignore unfamiliar numbers. We get so much email spam and phishing attempts that we often ignore online requests for polling. So for one thing, it's harder to find people. It's harder to get to people. Obviously, during a pandemic, knocking on their doors is not a great way to get polling information either. And of course, there's the perennial question, which has been debated on both sides. And again, I'm no expert on this, about whether people tell the truth when pollsters call. That humans, weirdly enough, I've always found this rather fascinating. Sort of, why do people get into fights with complete strangers on anonymous internet bulletin boards? Why would anybody care what a complete stranger who you don't know and never will see thinks? And yet, when a complete stranger who's a pollster calls you and asks you questions, many pollsters suspect that there may be a bias towards giving the answer that the pollee thinks is the sort of socially acceptable answer that will please the pollster. I don't know how you sort that out. I am certain of one thing, which is that following this election, just as after 2016, there's going to be a whole lot of soul searching on the part of pollsters, asking themselves, what are we getting wrong? Is there something we can do differently? And I don't know what that is.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think one of the things that, has been so often said in the press before the election is we learned from 2016, right? And so, everything has been corrected, and, we've seen something that looks a lot like 2016.
I'm not sure the pollsters learned, but I think the American public did learn something. My sense is talking, I'm sure this has been the same for all of you, talking to friends, colleagues, family members in the last few months, that ordinary people are much more skeptical about trusting the polls this time around than they were in 2016.
So,
go ahead. Can I just add one quick thing? I think there's a structural problem in their polling of rural areas. I used to live for a long time in Wisconsin, and you get 2 minutes out of Milwaukee and there are cows. A lot of America lives in a rural settings, and I think there must be a structural. And a lot of those voters go for Trump. There must be some structural problem where they are not getting rural voters. They're also maybe not getting as educated voters. There may be a difference in communicating and how they communicate, but somebody's really got to do something because it's misleading. And the press only adds to distrust when it relies upon them. And so finally, Michael Sandel has written a really good book about why we shouldn't have contempt for those who are less educated, called The Tyranny of Meritocracy. So it's worth us really paying attention to that as an educational point.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Professor Francois, do you, before we get on to the kind of the various litigation possibilities, do you want to weigh in on polls, or do you want to move to litigation?
I'd rather move to litigation. I know nothing about polls.
So what are kind of the litigation possibilities that we should be thinking about, and how likely are they of success?
Yeah, I mean, let me briefly sketch out where we are right now. I think going into the election, one of the concerns or questions that those of us working in election law had was the extent to which the Supreme Court would be called upon to step in and how much of a role Bush v. Gore would play. It is still possible that it will play a role, though it looks increasingly less likely. And for that, I think we need to step back and understand how the case might have played a role. When we talk about Bush v. Gore, we're really talking about two separate decisions. I'll call them for short Bush v. Gore 1 and Bush v. Gore 2. And number one essentially stand broadly for the idea that, particularly after an election, state courts were not free to change certain aspects of the election rules, because that would be a violation, presumably, of Article 1 in terms of how the legislatures of the states are empowered to choose electors. And Bush Gore 2 indicated that even when a particular change did not necessarily implicate the way the state chooses electors, there might still be a problem if the change, in fact, was so random or affected folks to such an extent that it raised an equal protection question in terms of how much weight was given to one particular vote as opposed to another. I mean, for those of us who lived through this, if you recall, the question Bush v. Gore 2 was the extent to which a few thousand votes out of Miami-Dade and Palm Beach could be counted because they were undervotes, where the voter had chosen everything in the ballot except for the vote of president. And the reason why supposedly is that they had not supposedly punched a hole in the ballot, the so-called hanging chad. And the conclusion the court came to in part was that, well, to the extent that Miami-Dade and Palm Beach were seeking to cure it under this randomized process, whereas other folks who run the state did not have this opportunity, it sort of devalued others' votes. So that's the broad summary of Bush v. Gore. And there were three pieces of litigation that were coming up prior to the election: one out of Wisconsin, one out of North Carolina, and one out of Pennsylvania. And all three involve the same question: to what extent could the state extend the deadline for mail-in and absentee ballots to be received and still be counted. And all 3 states had extended the deadline. In the case of Wisconsin, the deadline was extended by a federal district court. In the case of North Carolina, it was extended by a consent decree agreed to by the state electoral board after everybody had sort of chimed in. In the case of Pennsylvania, it was extended by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, interpreting a provision of Pennsylvania Constitution. In the Wisconsin case, the Supreme Court essentially told Wisconsin no because the district court could not interfere. In the case, in both for North Carolina and Pennsylvania, the extension went through. Now, the thing about Wisconsin is that in some sense, it doesn't really matter anymore because the deadline was not extended. So there's unlikely to be litigation over that aspect of it. In the case of North Carolina, I don't think that's an issue anymore because my understanding is that Trump is winning North Carolina. So the only possibility is Pennsylvania. And right now, presumably there's about 1 million outstanding votes, but there's no indication that those votes were part of the extension, if you will. So what does that mean in terms going forward for litigation? Well, I mean, there is a possibility that the Trump administration could seek to revive the Pennsylvania lawsuit by essentially trying to find some way of halting the count and then challenging a fairly huge amount of these votes. But I'm not entirely sure, though, what the theory of the case would be. Part of the reason why there's some uncertainty in that is that in Justice Kavanaugh, together with Justice Gorsuch, had basically hinted, without the other justices necessarily joining it, that even in an instance in which a state Supreme Court interpreting a state constitution provision, that might still be subject to review by the Supreme Court if, in fact, the particular change that was brought about by the state Supreme Court was what Justice Kavanaugh called in a footnote, so significant that it implicated Article 1. But it is not a theory that the other justices necessarily join in full. Justice Kavanaugh cited as support for that theory Justice Rehnquist's concurring opinion in Bush v. Gore 2. And I think many of us think that it's perhaps a bit taking the interpretation of Bush v. Gore 2 a bit too far. So I think this is where we are right now. It seems as if, while it's not entirely certain, there seems to be a lesser and lesser likelihood that, in fact, Bush v. Gore will be seriously implicated. But having said that, I have no way of predicting how aggressive the Trump administration will be in starting litigation. I know that they're entitled to a recount if they wish in Nevada. I know they've already brought a lawsuit in Michigan State Court saying that they were not necessarily allowed the observers in the room during the count, though it doesn't necessarily seem that's quite accurate. And they're saying they're going to start litigation over Pennsylvania. But to me, I still don't see a clear path for that litigation to end up in the same scenario as we ended up in Florida in 2000 under Bush v. Gore.
Okay. Professor Barnett, what are your thoughts about possible litigation?
I sort of adopt a practice when it comes to any discussion of possible litigation to wait until I hear the arguments of the litigators before I decide who has a chance and who doesn't have a chance, because I find that I'm not smart enough or knowledgeable enough about enough areas of law to be able to formulate all these legal challenges myself. So I have to wait and hear it. And then when I hear an argument, then I'll have some idea of whether I think it's plausible or not. So I don't know two things I would need to know to assess this. One is I don't know what the facts on the ground are. I'm not there. I don't have any sources who are there. So, for example, if Republican poll watchers are being shut out or not being shut out of watching or accounts that are being made and whether that's a violation of state law, I don't know either one of those two things. So I really couldn't assess the merits of that. The only thing I kind of do know is Justice Alito's opinion in the last Pennsylvania lawsuit, where on a 4-4 vote they declined to hear appeal of Republican Party of a state Supreme Court ruling. And all I just know is what Justice Alito suggested in that opinion that he wrote, which was joined by 3 justices, and that is that the state of Pennsylvania passed a statute regulating elections in March in order to deal with COVID and other things. It had several provisions in it. There was a non-severability clause that said if any one of these provisions is invalidated, all the provisions are invalid. The entire law goes down, in an express severability clause because it was a product of a legislative bargain that took place in the Pennsylvania legislature. So the different components of this bill was to allow votes to be counted, votes that had been received and postmarked up until 8 o'clock on election day to be counted. To allow for mail-in voting. And mail-in voting was to be allowed as long as voting was limited to votes that were received by postmarked by 8 o'clock on election day. Apparently, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, and I looked at some of the opinion is 63 pages long. And Bill, I love you, but I'm not going to read that 63-page long opinion for this program. I did look at the beginning and scroll through it, and I looked at the conclusion at the end just to see if it was being correctly represented. And what the Supreme Court did there is that they said that they were going to extend the deadline for counting votes that had been received by the deadline, but they were going to allow votes to be counted with having no postmark, because any vote that was received without a postmark would be presumed to have been voted within the deadline, and would have to be proven to not have been voted within the deadline, which I can't imagine how you would do. And it said that that those votes would be counted even if the signatures on the vote, the absentee vote or the mail-in vote didn't match the registered signature. Both of which I understand to be in violation of Pennsylvania law. And that is what Justice Alito said. He thought the court should have addressed that issue before the election, so that we wouldn't have to be arguing about it now. But we are arguing about it now. And then I would say the saving grace here is that if it looks like enough of the other electoral votes are decided to settle the race without having to worry about Pennsylvania's votes, then we're not going to be paying much attention to this. If that's not the case, if Arizona goes a different way than what it's been called by both the AP and Fox, and which local officials think is still possible, plus Michigan, and as long as North Carolina and Georgia remain where they are, Pennsylvania may very well matter, in which case I think we will be discussing this. And the question is, and I believe that Aderson, completely accurately portrayed this, it's going to be, does it violate Article 1 for a state Supreme Court using its own constitution to change the rules passed by the legislature when Article 1 gives the power to select electors to the legislature? And in Bush v. Gore, during that litigation, the U.S. Supreme Court reaffirmed that under federal law, when a national election is taking place, the legislature acts on its own behalf, and the state courts are not free to change what it does because of the state constitution. So, by the way, even if that lawsuit were to prevail, I don't know what the outcome of Pennsylvania will be. I don't know what the vote count is. And I guess there are something like 1 million votes that still to be counted. So I just don't know if that even tells us what the outcome is, but I think that tells us something about what the litigation would look like.
And so what remedy would they seek? I mean, I realize you started by saying you don't want to speculate, but
I mean, I think what's happening is that I think Pennsylvania officials represented to the court, or at least represented to someone, that they were going to segregate the votes that were received after yesterday, after election day, so that if they were not to be counted, they wouldn't be counted. So we would know which ones they were, and so presumably those votes would then be set aside. What we don't know is we don't know which votes have been counted, which votes have not been counted. We don't know if all the mail-in votes have been counted. We don't know if absentee votes have been counted. Or we don't know if in-person votes have been counted. I mean, maybe somebody knows that, but I don't know that.
And Professor Francois, you were going to jump in?
No, I was simply going to talk about the issue of segregation, because it's true that Pennsylvania sort of agreed ahead of time to segregate those votes that would fall within the extended deadline. The one thing I agree with when they said, but the one sort of modification that I would make is that I'm not entirely sure that I would phrase the question in terms of whether or not a state Supreme Court has the power to change the rules. I mean, I guess it's classic, sort of the way we as litigators would phrase a problem, but it seems to me it doesn't matter how one phrase the question, because the way that the state Supreme Court, with the opinion, is that it reasoned that it was not changing the rules, that rather it was interpreting a provision of the state constitution as it has the power to do, to adapt to the circumstances or the challenges posed by COVID. Number one. Number two, I think even Justice Kavanaugh, the way that he wrote the opinion in footnote 1, he didn't suggest that it would be a problem if there was a change. He suggested there would be a problem if there was a significant change to those rules. So again, it remains to be seen.
I want to agree that this is exactly the debate that was had during the litigation leading up to Bush v. Gore. We for at least a few weeks, we debated exactly how this should be characterized. Should it be characterized as a state courts that were actually changing the law, or in fact is the Constitution of Florida part of the law? And when the Supreme Court of Florida enforces that versus a statute, that's part of state law. That's exactly the debate that was held back then, and I expect that would be exactly the debate we would be once again having if we ever get to litigation on this.
And Professor Nourse, do you have any thoughts on the litigation?
Well, no, I think that's exactly what we will get with, and that's what Justice Kavanaugh was signaling with his concerns. I mean, there are 3 justices who were involved in some way in Bush versus Gore who are sitting on that court. So
Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Roberts,
and Justice Barrett. They full well know this, and because Article 2 says legislature, the term legislature is very clear. This, says legislatures can set the manners of elections. Congress can overrule that. I would be looking for a bipartisan amendment here to do something with Pennsylvania. I don't know what's going on in Pennsylvania with the way they count votes. I think state courts are in difficult positions. These judges have to decide. They do have to interpret something. So imagine you're a state court in Pennsylvania. And we have this difficult question and a deep one. It's a jurisprudential one about, are you making law when you interpret? Are you undoing the legislation? Are you making law? And so, or are you simply acting as a court, applying your own state's constitution to which you have a duty? Now, of course, there is something called the Supremacy Clause. So the federal constitution trumps the state constitution. So it's a really difficult question. And that would come up if we get down to the Pennsylvania scenario. And I'm glad they're segregating the ballots. That will make it easier to determine whether that would actually make a difference, obviously, in whether the electoral votes would go to a particular candidate. Because if it doesn't make a difference, we won't get there. I mean, I, for one, would prefer that the court stay way out of these, just for its own institutional, perception. The people perceive Bush versus Gore as a terrible decision because they perceive it as a decision not about this jurisprudential debate, but they perceive it as deciding an election, and that's not what a court should do. So I know that, the Chief Justice wants the court to maintain its integrity and has worked very hard to maintain it. And so I think there would be some pushback within the court from actually, I think that he's crossing his fingers 17 times saying, I don't want this Pennsylvania case to come back. I really don't want it to come back.
May I add one last thing?
I do want to point out that in Bush v. Gore, it was the Democratic candidate, Al Gore, who first went to court to challenge how votes were being counted in those three counties. The reason why it was those three counties that were at issue, both in local court, Court of Appeals, and then the state Supreme Court, is those were the three counties that the Gore campaign challenged. And that's why it was all focused on those counties. So in terms of who went, if to the extent President Trump is going to be criticized for going to court, and I understand, at least look like a news feed, that he's already filing suit in Pennsylvania. It was the Gore campaign that went to court in Bush v. Gore and got that whole ball rolling.
Well, I mean, may I add one last thing, Dean, because I think it seems to me that we've talked about this sort of implicitly, but we have talked about it explicitly. You know, there's one very important, it seems to me, factual difference between Bush v. Gore and our present scenario. And whether or not it has any sort of legal significance, I think it matters to talk about, because it might, in fact, come to play in the reasoning of the court. You know, at the end of the day, in Bush v. Gore, it was a mess in part because there was some fundamental design problem in the way that Florida was running its election, the way that the ballots were designed, etc. What we're talking about now is that in all three instances, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, what these jurisdictions did was merely trying to extend the deadline for voting in the midst of a global pandemic. That's it. In other words, it wasn't necessarily an attempt to sort of fix some other mess like Florida was trying to do. It was simply an attempt of suggesting, how do we deal with the fact that for the first time in this country, we're going to have an avalanche of mail-in voting, that these mail-in votings are going to pose a problem, that we seem to be having a problem with the US Post Office, and you're going to have a huge number of voters who may be doing mail-in voting for the first time, and there may indeed be problems with things like signatures. That was the core of the problem, which to me makes this a very different thing than Florida 2000.
Well, let me respond. The lawsuit in Pennsylvania was the lawsuit on which that created this situation was initiated by the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania, which sued to enjoin the operation of the statute that the Pennsylvania legislature had enacted in March, a bipartisan statute to regulate how this election was going to be conducted. It was the Democratic Party that went to court to change the operation of that statute. And then it was Democratic elected state Supreme Court justices who agreed with them and ruled that those changes would be made. The result of those changes are that votes are supposed to be tabulated, even if they are received after Election Day, cannot be proved to have been voted prior to Election Day or on Election Day, and whose signatures cannot be validated because they may or may not match the signatures and registration cards. This is a recipe for voter fraud. It's a recipe to find, I mean, I'm not saying voter fraud is going to happen, but I think if you want to make voter fraud possible, you eliminate the way in which we tell whether votes are validly cast. When I was I was mentioning it earlier, when I was a prosecutor in Chicago, one of our duties is to patrol election polling places during election. When my boss was being up for election, re-election, I was patrolling polling places. And one of the things we did when we patrolled, what are we going to do? Well, we stood behind the election judges and we watched them compare the application for a ballot, which is filled out in the polling place, with the registration signature. And so I was standing behind an election judge, and I looked down, and I just was spot checking them, checking the signatures. And it turns out that there was one signature on this voting application didn't have anything to do with the signature, didn't look anything like the signature that was on the binder. So, and then once I noticed that, I looked to see it. Well, the signature on the binder is by somebody who was very, very elderly. And I looked up and I saw this young kid. So you have a big age discrepancy. And I wouldn't have even noticed that if I hadn't seen this signature discrepancy. And so eventually that person had to be arrested, although that turned out to be quite a challenge to even get that person arrested.
I mean, 2 points.
But that was just one instance. I'm saying is that if you eliminate that safeguard, and you eliminate the time refrain, and then you find out how many votes a particular party needs, you can supply those votes in a fraudulent manner, and there'd be no way of finding out if they were fraudulent. That is what the original law was designed to prevent. And that's the safeguards that were being eliminated, so far as I understand, by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. So that is, now, I'm not saying anything like that happened, but how do we know it's going to happen unless we follow the law?
So let me
two things, and I'm sure Dean wants to move on. My point wasn't about which party was doing what and whose ox is being gored. My point is that we are finding ourselves in this situation because for the last few months, jurisdictions have struggled to account for a unique scenario, namely the American public voting in a pandemic. And as far as the issue of fraud is concerned, I've spent years debating this issue, and I've yet to be presented. I've been presented with many instances of anecdotes of fraud, but I've yet to be presented with evidence of the sort of systemic fraud that folks are so concerned about that justifies making it harder for people to vote. And I think, at some point we have to be honest about this, that we seem to be engaged in a sort of asymmetric battle where one side is so over concerned with fraud that they want to limit, access to the ballot to as many people as possible, whereas the other side want to expand it as much as possible. And if the concern is fraud, at some point we have to begin talking about it on the basis of not just anecdotes, but evidence of fraud.
But I think what the issue before the court is going to be is whether the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania properly modified a statute that was a compromise statute, a bipartisan statute enacted by the legislature of Pennsylvania to address this issue, and whether that's constitutional or not, whether they were proper in doing that. That's the legal question that we're going to have to decide. As far as the argument of whether there is or is not systemic fraud, I mean, I grew up in Cook County, Illinois. I know what systemic fraud is, what living in a society, in a country, in a polity that has systemic fraud is like, when voting machines show up in voting areas that already have Democratic votes on the voting machine, when they're uncovered, when the election judges there are Democratic election judges and there are Republican election judges, and the Republican election judges are also Democrats. I grew up in this kind of a system, and it's systemic in that system. I never grew up in Philadelphia, so I don't know how Philadelphia varies from Chicago, and I don't know what Chicago's like today. But the issue isn't whether there's systemic fraud. The issue is whether there is the opportunity for fraud in Pennsylvania on the basis of these rules in a close election. That is the issue, and whether the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania acted properly when it modified the statute. If that what goes to the court, that's what the court's going to be decided.
Yeah. So I think that's a very, very clear way to kind of frame the issues of the litigation that would move forward. One thing, now I want to go back to something we talked briefly earlier. So Dean Brooks, you made the point that the media doesn't announce who the winner is, that Fox has said.
They try.
So how is the winner actually chosen? Why don't you?
So I am not an expert on this, and I'm afraid I'm going to get this wrong because I get confused every time I start thinking about it. And so I hope my colleagues will chime in and correct me as I get the dates and the process mixed up. I'm not an election law expert, but remember we have a system in which, for better or for worse, and I think in almost every way today, in my opinion, it's for worse, the winner of the most votes from the most human beings who are citizens of this country does not automatically become the president. We have the Electoral College. And so in each state, the votes are tallied up. And then the states, the Constitution gives states a fair amount of latitude in how they choose a slate of Electoral College electors. And in most states, what they do is they count the votes. They say, oh, look, a majority of the votes have gone to this particular candidate. Therefore, our slate of electors will be pledged to vote in the Electoral College for this particular candidate. In a handful of states, they have divvied it up so that if there's 60% of the votes go to candidate A and 40% to candidate B, they'll divide up their electors in that way. Those electors are then certified by the states. Different states have somewhat different laws concerning the precise process for how that works. There's a deadline, and I can't remember what it is for the life of me after a night with not enough sleep. There's a deadline that comes up pretty soon for states to certify their electors. Those electors go out to the Electoral College. I believe the date is December 14th. And they, I believe, I'm now getting worried that I'm going to get this all wrong. So Vic, please help me, save me, or Aderson or Randy, one of you save me if I start going off track here. But I believe that what then happens is, I think on December 14th, they go to Congress, and Mike Pence, as the vice president, in his ceremonial, mostly ceremonial role, looks at that count and does a kind of ceremonial, okay, Vermont, what say you? And Vermont says, we have, however many electoral votes, and they're going to go to Joe Biden. And then he says, what say you, Texas? And Texas says, we've got 800 more electoral votes than Vermont, and they're going to go to Donald Trump. And they kind of go down and make a little list and add it all up. And in a normal circumstances, this is a formality. Because it's pretty clear. It's possible to imagine all sorts of crazy scenarios in which we get ties, in which we get rival slates and so on. I don't think that's very likely, so I'm not sure we even want to go down that road. But that's still not over then, right? Then we got a little list, but then Congress meets in a joint session on, I believe, January 6th. And that is the official time when both houses of Congress kind of look at this and say, okay, here's who the next president is, so-and-so, prepare yourself for your inauguration, which is going to occur in a few weeks. And until that, my understanding is that no matter what anybody says, until that joint session of Congress has declared formally a winner, we have a projected winner. We don't have an official next president, even though obviously we were kind of sloppy. We use terms like president-elect. There are lots of steps along the way. My friends who are election law experts assure me that this is a terrible, terrible area to specialize in, because the law here is convoluted, full of gaps, confusing, mysterious, horrible, ugly, etc. And there are all kinds of opportunities along the way to inauguration for uncertainties and ambiguities to be exploited, for game playing, et cetera, et cetera. Luckily for us, that's extraordinarily rare. And I hope to God that in 2020 and early 2021, that will remain the case.
Very good. And Professor Nourse, you've been nodding. Is there anything that you'd like to add?
No, I loved it.
Did I mess that up?
No, I loved it. I remember you got the what say you and all that kind of thing. Vermont, it's all. Yeah.
I don't know enough to know if you got it wrong, Rosa.
That sounded good. Okay.
That proves my point about how we need to teach civics to our law students.
Right.
Because this stuff matters.
And this is just a function of, COVID brain rot or something, though, because I promise you that this has been taught to me by my election law expert friends multiple times, and yet somehow I'm just incapable of fully processing it.
Very good. Okay, so we're almost out of time, so I have one final question. So let's be optimistic, and we have a resolution soon that's widely accepted. But moving forward, what kind of structural change do we need to consider to improve our process? What change should we put in place so that that we don't have crises in the future? Am I going to have to cold call on people?
I think minimal electoral reform. I mean, it's not aggressive. HR 1's pretty aggressive, which is something the House has passed. But, there are things that, the founders anticipated that the states might kind of try to mess each other up in the processes of setting their electoral the manners of their elections, and that could affect the federal government. They were not stupid when they set up the Electoral College, even though everyone hates it. And they were not stupid when they said Congress shall have the power to set uniform rules. That's not the precise terminology, but in fact, they can. So for things like absentee ballots, I mean, this is the kind of detail and when they're counted and when they're postmarked. I mean, it really bothered me, I have to say, that the Supreme Court is trying to decide when Wisconsin's ballots are postmarked or not. And maybe they had to do that under their vision of the Constitution. I don't want to get into that argument. But it just seems that the more rational policy-making system would have Congress set some days. And in the past, they have set up things that make, say, the voter registration form uniform throughout the country. Simple things like that could go a long way to avoid some of these things. Now, as Aderson said, some of this is because of a hopefully once in 100-year pandemic. So on the other hand, it would be nice, since we've had this before, we've had the Chads, it's not like this is new. And someone said, if you do something 3 times, it's the definition of folly. We've done this twice. Let's not do it again. We can pass legislation, it seems to me, to solve some of the mechanical problems in terms of when you count, what you count, etc.
Okay. Other suggestions for what we might do moving forward?
I think I want to pick up on what Vic said, because, to be blunt, I think that at the end of the day, it is a little bit absurd that in a wealthy Western democracy, we make it as difficult as we do for people to vote. Now, I know that HR1 might solve some of these issues, but to me, sitting back as somebody who's written about this for so long and litigated these cases, what it felt like to me this year was almost as if, voter suppression, intimidation, the hyper-technical rules, the random application of the rule, the endless litigation, all of these skimming techniques were skimming techniques that we rehearsed on Black people for hundreds of years, for years and years and years. It's like a show that we took on the road to perfect its kinks. And now we have its Broadway debut. So in other words, the way that we suppressed a lot of the things that were being done against whites in this election, they sort of morphed a bit, but we've been doing it for a very, very long time. And I think at the end of the day, we have to basically do some reckoning with that. How is it that we call ourselves a democracy, and yet, my God, voting is such a pain? How did that happen?
Professor Barnett?
This is not my area, and I don't have any what I would consider to be knowledgeable opinions. I think it's good to have these views in advance of a case or controversy rather than generated just for whatever case and controversy happens to be in front of us. So the only thing I would say is that I'm a fan of the Electoral College system. I'm in the sense of not necessarily every step that has to be done in order to achieve it, but the idea that we vote state by state. It has a number of important benefits, but the benefit that is most salient here is that we only have to worry about either incompetence or fraud in a handful of states that make a difference. And then we can all be focused on Philadelphia or Pennsylvania or Michigan. We don't have to be focused on every vote that's been cast in the whole country. Can you imagine if we had a national popular vote, every vote, however it was counted throughout the United States, would be at issue? Potentially at issue. Instead of just focusing on this jurisdiction or Florida here or Pennsylvania there, we can deal with that. But to try to open up every single vote so whatever any polling place is doing in any place around the country, it's all going to add up to the national popular vote. So you better go out and fight everywhere at all. I can't even imagine how hellish that would be. We're spared that by the Electoral College system, in which we have to worry about state by state, and primarily we only have to worry about swing states that are competitive. And that narrows the focus of what we have to focus on in any given election. And I think that, let's put it this way, it's like compartmentalization on a submarine. You want to be able to seal off a leak so that it doesn't affect the whole sub. And so you have every compartment has watertight seals. And that is kind of what that's a benefit of the Electoral College. It's not the reason we've got it. It's not the reason it was put in there, but it is a benefit that we enjoy every time we have one of these messes.
Dean Brooks, final comment?
Alternatively, Randy, to go with your submarine metaphor, that's kind of the equivalent of just saying, okay, everybody in California and New York is going to drown because we don't care about them. We're making certain states watertight and everybody else doesn't matter. And I'll
take that as a friendly amendment.
Okay. But I think, obviously I disagree about the Electoral College. And one thing I will say, my sort of ostensible area of expertise is foreign policy, national security issues. So I spend a lot of my time talking to people around the globe who look at America, sometimes look to it as a model, sometimes look to it as a warning. And it is astonishing how, well, two things are astonishing to me. One is I've worked in past points in my life, particularly years ago when I was at the State Department, on US democracy promotion and election monitoring programs. And we as a nation, and this has been true under Republican administrations as well as under Democratic administrations, we're pretty clear about what we believe is a free, fair, and peaceful election in other countries. And we're quite quick to say to other countries, you're doing it wrong, that's not democratic. Our own systems would not stand up to the kind of scrutiny we subject other countries to. And the other piece of that is that when I talk to representatives of US allies and partners, they are looking at us at this point saying, what's going on? We thought you guys were a democracy, but your system is that doesn't look democratic to us at all. Between gerrymandering, between voter suppression, between the Electoral College, which means that the popular vote winner can end up not being the person who ends up in the White House. You could go on and on and on and on. We don't look like a democracy to most of the world anymore. And that has baffled our friends and empowered despotic regimes around the globe. And so to me, that's a real problem. The last things I would just add in terms of change for the future, one, I think obviously, we said this after the 2000 election, we said this after 2016, and we really have never acted fully on it. We need to have clearer national level best practices on the mechanics of voting and counting the vote. We have a federal system. That doesn't mean every state's going to do it, but at least to sort of say, we do actually know a lot. And we're always telling other countries about best practices to reduce fraud, to ensure that voting is accessible, to ensure that voting is less likely to be hacked or manipulated. We should do a much better job of both of promulgating those and ideally from congressionally helping provide money to states that want to reform antiquated systems and ensure that they have paper trail backups and ensure that they have enough funds to get this right. So we're not constantly in the world of, oh, look, it turns out that this precinct does it differently than this precinct, and it's inefficient and it's slow, and oops, we don't have any paper backup, so who the heck knows? Part of that is about protecting our systems from potentially being vulnerable to foreign cyber attacks, et cetera. Part of that, frankly, is protecting them from being vulnerable to domestic hacking and cyber attacks and other forms of manipulation, some of which may not be as sophisticated as cyber attack, which may simply be, good old-fashioned mechanical forms of fraud, which I don't think are rampant, but can exist. That's absolutely. And then the other big fundamental that I would just highlight, and I know we're out of time, I think a huge challenge for all of us, and this is going to be a challenge not for a presidential administration, but for a generation, is that our society is extraordinarily divided right now, and increasingly Americans live in parallel information universes that don't intersect with one another. And, I always try, I'm a Democrat, I always try to make sure that every day I take a look I see what Fox is saying, I see what Breitbart is saying, I see what the even more further right websites are saying, because I want to know, and I think to myself, boy, if that's all I ever read, my views would probably be really different, and I think many of us do that. We try to do that because we really want to know and understand how is it that people who think really differently from us come to hold the views that they hold. And obviously sometimes people have deep differences of principle and conviction, but some of the time it's because of active disinformation efforts, again, sometimes foreign, sometimes homegrown, and taking on both the problem of specifically disinformation, but also the problem of the lack of mechanisms that push Americans to be talking to each other rather than talking in parallel universe and talking past each other. That's a challenge that is going to be terrifically hard. I don't have any easy answer, but I think to come together as a nation to tackle some of the enormous problems that we collectively face. It doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican, whether it's pandemics or the impact of climate change or race relations in America or rising income inequality, whatever it is, we're going to need to find ways to do all this stuff together, even if we disagree on a lot, which is going to mean that we're going to need to find some way to have a shared information universe between us.
I think that's a wonderful way to end, and that's actually kind of a theme of a number of the student questions was, how do we move forward? I focus specifically on electoral reform, but I think very much on many of our students' minds is how do we move forward as a society at a point in which we become so sharply divided? So, Dean Brooks, that's a very powerful way to end. So. These are issues of the greatest moment. And what I was hoping to do was to have, a conversation of engagement. And we're just so extraordinarily fortunate to have you as experts and to help us think these through. So Dean Brooks, Professor François, Professor Barnett, and Professor Nourse, thank you very much for this remarkable conversation. Thanks to our audience for submitting so many terrific questions. Take care, everyone, and stay well.